Thank you, everybody, for joining us today for a lunch conversation that is hosted by the Corporations and Society Initiative, or CASI, which I initiated and I'm the faculty director of. My name is Anat Admati, and I'm a professor of finance and economics here at GSB. CASI, in the second year of its existence, uses research, advocacy, and education to develop a holistic understanding of the complex ways in which individuals, corporations, and governments interact, to emphasize the importance of effective governance and accountability in all private and public institutions so that we can create a trustworthy system. We try to promote what we now call civic-minded leadership, civic-minded capitalism, to ensure that the system works. Tobins Philippon, our guest today, is a fellow finance academic, the Max Hain Professor of Finance at Stern School of Business at NYU. He has a PhD from MIT, and he's written extensively on many topics in finance and economics. He's here to speak about his book, The Great Reversal: How Americans Gave Up on Free Markets, where he lays out the evidence about corporate concentration, market power, particularly in the US, and the cost that accompany it. So I will give away the bottom line. If you want to know why Americans are paying more for goods and services, from cell phones to healthcare to airlines and banking, Tomas's answer in one word is politics. More specifically, money in politics. So ultimately, the machinery of US democracy is not really delivering the best outcomes for the citizens. And he argues that the problem is more severe here than in Europe in particular, which is sort of where he comes from and his point of comparison. There's exhaustive research in this book and innovative argumentation that I really will commend Tomas for. And he captures the social, economic, and political moment that we're living in. So the plan is he will give a 20-minute presentation, and I'll ask him a few questions, and then I'll open it up. We have a lot of great people here who have a lot of questions. We're going to have mics that would come to you so that we can have better audio. And then please take your trash coming out. With that, I want to welcome Tobins Philippon to Stanford Business School.
Thank you. Thank you all for being here. It's always such a great pleasure to come back to Stanford with so many friends and colleagues in the audience, and students and more. So like Anat said, I'm going to give you the 20-minute version of the book, so I hope you forgive me. I'm going to skip many of the technical details, and also I'm not going to mention the caveats. So let me start by telling you why I call the book The Great Reversal. And it's actually quite simple, because I came to the US 20 years ago as a PhD student. Like Anat mentioned, I went to do my grad school at MIT. And the most striking thing that I noticed when I arrived at MIT from Paris, in that case, was that many of the things I needed as a student were much cheaper in the US. Starting with buying a laptop. You might not remember that for the young people in the audience, but there was a time where if you were not American, your friends at home would email you knowing that you would come back for Christmas, asking you to buy a laptop for them, because it was literally 40% cheaper. Then, of course, this is the pre-broadband internet. Okay, that means to download data online, you need to dial up with a modem. And in Europe, you paid by the minute. That is, if you had to spend 3 hours online to get the data you needed, you would pay by the minute for 3 hours. As a student, that was too expensive. So we didn't really exploit the power of the internet because of that. As soon as I landed in Boston, I realized, wow, actually it's different here because local calls are free. Therefore, I can spend 3 hours online getting the data, and it cost me nothing. Well, it cost me a cost per month, but the marginal cost was zero. So accessing internet was a lot cheaper here than in Paris. Every time I say a lot cheaper, just to be clear, I don't mean 5%. I mean 30 or 40%. Okay? And then I realized, to be a good researcher, you need to go to conferences to listen to, people who are the stars of their field. So if you go to a finance conference to listen to Darrell Duffy, it's worth your time. In Europe, though, I would have had to drive or take the train because plane tickets were more expensive. But in the US, I could fly, actually, even as a student, even on a tight budget, because airline tickets were, again, 40% cheaper than in Europe. So this was the US 20 years ago compared to Europe 20 years ago. And I call the book The Great Reversal because every single fact I gave you today is upside down. Okay? So today, this is what you pay for broadband in the US, and you are roughly twice as expensive as every other developed country in the world. Okay? So it's not even close. Every country is between 30 and 40 dollars per month for high-speed broadband internet. This is normalized for the same speed. Okay? So we're talking about the same contract. The US is at 68. Okay? There's no other large, rich country which is anywhere close to that number. What happened? Well, in the telecommunication sector, you see, that's when I arrived, 2000. And I'm showing you here the markup and the concentration ratio. So markup is kind of price minus cost. That's the evolution starting from 0 early in the sample. Concentration, I measure here CR8. So that's the simplest measure you can imagine. You just take the top 8 firms in an industry, and you look at their market share, okay, and you add it up. So I arrive here at the peak of competition. Okay, concentration was pretty low, and prices were low. Over the following 20 years, you see a sustained increase in concentration by about 20%, and 20 percentage points. Okay, so that's a big number, and the markup also up by about 40%. This is pretty much, so that's half of what happened for the telecom, because in Europe at the same time we went the other way, so we became cheaper. So this is how you end up with such a difference, which again, the striking thing is not just that today the prices are much higher here, is that it used to be the opposite 20 years ago. So this is just one industry. The book goes through a bunch of examples, including airlines and stuff, but let me just skip that and go directly to the big picture. So let's zoom out, try to put all the pieces together. There's all the industries. When you do that, there's tons of technical issues that I'm going to skip. So this is using the census, and we are looking at the evolution of CR8 over time. Okay. So CR8 went up by about maybe 6 points in manufacturing, 8 points in non-manufacturing, so say average for the economy by about 7 points, which is about a quarter of the starting value. So average concentration in your typical industry in the US went up by about a quarter. That means if you had 4 dominating firms, now you're down to 3. If you had 8, you're down to 6. Okay, just to get a sense of the magnitude. So that's for the concentration. What that means is that this picture here is, of course, much more striking. Like the numbers are bigger in the telecom industry, but the broad evolution is similar in many other industries, although not all of them. What about prices and markups? Well, it's kind of the same story. So this is again, for the entire private sector in the US, that's profits over value added. So that moves around at business cycle frequencies. Every time there's a recession, profits go down more than GDPs, therefore pi over y goes down. But it was fluctuating around 7% until 2000, and today it's still fluctuating, but around something like 10%. Okay, so a significant increase in profit margins in the entire private sector. Now, the facts that I just showed you, they are not too controversial in the sense that we sort of agree that that's what the data says, but where we disagree a lot as economists is in the interpretation of the facts. And at the risk of making a bit of a caricature, I'm going to spin it as good versus bad concentration, because that captures most of the debate. Okay? It's more subtle than that, but I think you get the gist of the argument by just doing good versus bad. So you could have good concentration when the market leaders increase their comparative advantage. Okay, so imagine an industry where the leaders are 10% more productive than the rest, and now they become 15% more productive than the rest. Okay, so that's great. Productivity is going up. Typically, when that happens, either quality is going up or prices are going down or both. But of course, as a side effect of that, they're going to steal market shares from the less efficient competitors. So you're going to see in the data an increase in concentration. You might even see an increase in profits, actually, because the leaders are more efficient. So typically, their margins are a bit higher. Okay. But we would still say that's good concentration because prices are going down, quality is going up, productivity is going up. Typically, in the data, it comes together with significant investment in intangible assets. Okay. Most of the big gains that we see like that in a recent past, say the past 20 years or 30 years, was driven by intangible investment. So when you see this cluster of high intangible investment, fast productivity growth, lower prices, you might see concentration, but you're still happy about the outcome. So that's called Let's call that good concentration. The bad concentration is when you don't see that, which means that the concentration is happening not so much because the leaders are getting better, but because they are better at building fences around their industry so nobody can compete with them. Okay? So when that happens, you're going to see high prices, productivity either the same or lower, and barriers to entry, meaning you're going to see a sharp drop in entry rates. Okay? So when you see that kind of cluster in the data, you're worried. And there are plenty of examples. So clearly, if you look at the retail and wholesale trade sector in the US, it looks very much like the good concentration story. And if you look at telecoms, airlines, and healthcare, it looks very much like the bad one. Okay? But these are just a few industries. The question is, what's the balance between good and bad concentration on average in the economy? So that's what I want to understand. So I'll show you the data on that. And then by answering that question, we'll be able to also talk about technology versus policy, which is what is the driving force in the background? Okay? Or how much is technology, how much is policy? So let's start with good concentration. There are many examples, but I think the most striking one is Walmart. So Walmart had 0% market share in 1970, and it went up to 60% market share. Okay? So that's a massive, for just one firm. So it's obviously by far the biggest expansion ever of one firm in the US in recent years. And what happened? Well, essentially, it was all IT-based. It was all based on intangible investment that Walmart made somewhere in the mid-80s to the mid-90s, where they essentially, maybe revolution is too strong, but clearly they had a drastic impact on what today we call supply management. They invented many of the technologies. They became extremely efficient. So productivity growth for them and for the entire industry was very high. But strikingly, their profit margin was flat, if anything, actually slightly declining. What that means is every 1% productivity gain that Walmart made turned into a 1% lower price. Okay? So that's a good deal for consumers. So when we see that in the data as economists, we like it. We think that's good concentration. The question then is, what we see today, does it look like Walmart or does it look like something else? And the first hint that maybe it's something else is that Walmart's expansion came with massive investments. Okay? And today, we don't see that. Okay? In fact, the reason I started working on this topic is because I wanted to understand this puzzle here. So this is the basic way we think about corporate investment, which is Q theory of investment. So the idea is very simple. At the end of the day, what should be the determinant of investment? Well, how much money you're going to make and what's your funding cost? When your margins are high and your funding cost is low, that's an environment where you expect firms to invest a lot. Okay? That theory works reasonably well. So this is the Tobins Q, which is exactly capturing that trade-off of your discounted value relative to the cost of replacing and funding the investment. It tracks the investment series pretty well. So green is net investment rate. So that, in other words, this is exactly the growth rate of the capital stock. But you see that something else is going on, which is even though the correlation remains pretty strong, there's this discrepancy here. In other words, if you look at all measures of profits and funding costs today, by all of these metrics, the market should be as bullish today as it was in the mid-90s. But in the mid-90s, the corporate capital stock, both tangible and intangible separately, was growing at 3% per year. And today, with the same macro or even better macro environment, it's only growing at 2% per year. So clearly something else is telling you that the firms are not that eager to invest. And if you believe, like I do, that some of the profits we've seen in recent years correspond to monopoly rents, then that could explain that puzzle. Because a monopoly, of course, is going to have high margins, but is not going to be as willing to expand as a competitive firm because the monopoly understands that by expanding, it's going to lower the price. OK, so this is just one-time series. So can we do better than that? Yeah, actually, you can. So if you look at this gap here and you discount it and you depreciate it going forward, you end up with a ballpark estimate of the capital stock, which is 7% below where it should be. Right? So in other words, if firms had followed the usual rule of investment, we would have about 7% more capital stock in the private sector. But it turns out this 7% gap is not at all uniform across industry. If you look at industries that did not become concentrated, that's the cumulative gap. It's 0. Okay? So in other words, if I look at industries that have not become more concentrated, then whatever they do with their investment looks very much like what I would predict with a simple benchmark neoclassical model. They invest according to funding cost and profits, like you would expect. But industries that have become more concentrated are exactly the ones where there is this gap. In other words, given their current margins and their funding costs, I would expect them to invest more. Okay? So that's about 14% gap. And the average, that's why the average in the aggregate is around 7%. But it's really an average of 0 here and 14 here. So that's a hint that this kind of concentration doesn't look like the Walmart of the 1990s. Now, investment is just one factor of, if you think about good versus bad. So suppose you put all the pieces together and you think about, can I have a view of the data where I'm going to try to cluster the data? When I see concentration in industry, I'm going to ask, do I see it together with intangible investment? So that was kind of the previous picture. But also with entry, lower prices, and productivity growth. So if I see this cluster of data, I'm going to call that good investment or good concentration. And then is there another cluster of data that looks like, we don't see any entry, we see prices going up, and we don't see strong productivity, or in fact, productivity is declining, then that's going to be bad concentration. And it turns out that if you just do a simple principal component, that kind of classification works pretty well. It does load naturally on the first and second principal component, and then you can plot the prevalence of each one over time. So the green one is showing the evolution of the prevalence of what I call, so here we call it intangible, because it's a kind of concentration that comes together with strong intangible investment. And it's kind of flat. So of course, I'm not saying it's disappeared. Okay, the US economy is large and diverse, so at any point in time, you always have a bunch of industries going through the kind of concentration that we like to see. Okay? But what's striking is that the prevalence of the other one, the one that looks more like barrier to entry style concentration, which was less prevalent than the green one, has become more prevalent over time. Okay? So that's the thing that I'm worried about. Okay, so the problem is, so I think if you go through the list and you look at all these industries, you can really get a strong sense that what we've seen in many industries today is not the kind of positive concentration we like to see. But it still doesn't answer the question of technology versus policy, because that's a very complicated one to answer. So then to make progress there, you would like to have some kind of control group. There's a bunch of industries that somehow are exposed to different regulations, even though they use the same technology. And I think that's where Europe comes in. So for the next 5 slides, I'm going to exclude the healthcare system, because that's too different between the two regions. And I'm also going to exclude the pure high-tech, that is the Google, Facebook, and Microsoft, because we don't have the same ones in Europe. Okay? So I'm going to get rid of them and compare industries like airlines, telecoms, where chemical engineering, pharmaceutical, where the technology is the same. Like the products are the same. It looks very similar in terms of technology. And I'm going to see whether the evolutions are the same in Europe. So in manufacturing, it's not that different. Maybe you could say there's a bit more action in the US, but the truth is, in manufacturing anyway, most of this is not a decrease in competition. It's more an increase in foreign trade. So if you adjust for the fact that there is more foreign competition, actually concentration is flat in manufacturing, so I'm not too worried. But this is the part where it's very different. Okay? That's where, of course, telecom, airlines, and all of these guys. Very strong concentration in the US and much weaker in Europe. So what about the profit margins? Well, same story. So the profit margin in Europe today are exactly what they were in the US 20 years ago. But of course, over these 20 years, the US went up a lot. Europe, well, you could argue it went down a little bit, which I believe actually is correct here. Post-2000 is mostly flat. This dip is because of the Eurozone crisis. Now it's back to around here. So post-2000 is roughly flat in Europe. It's not driven by differences in the composition of industries. Okay, so the triangle here takes the profit rates from Europe, but multiplies by the market share of US industries. Okay, so it's like rescaling Europe, so it has the same industry mix of the US, and you see the trend is exactly the same. So it's not a story of different industries or different composition. What happens in Europe? Well, in Europe, what happened was we started from a very low baseline rate of competition, and we reformed the market. So this is just counting the number of significant PMR, product market reform, year by year. So on average, there was one significant reform per country per year, clustered around the early 2000s. Okay. What are these reforms? Well, it depends on the industry. So I'm giving you one example here. So in the telecom industry, of course, a lot of the action is in the licensing. Do you going to have a spectrum in the wireless spectrum so you can run your business? So most of the deregulation consists of granting licenses to firms who want to enter. So in France, this is exactly what happened. So this is the relative price of telecommunication services, actually, sorry, communication services, unfortunately, so it's a bit coarser than what I would like, but it's communication services in France relative to the US, okay? And just you put them in the same currency using the nominal exchange rate. So France used to be, something like 10 to 20% more expensive than the US until 2011, and then in the span of 2 years, it became 25% cheaper. Now, this is a huge sector. That's like a big chunk of GDP. So price for an entire sector that moves by 40% in 2 years, you notice it in the data. Right? It's not like a little change. And it turns out only one thing happened in 2011. We went from 3 to 4. This here, until 2011, is an oligopoly with 3 main players, 3 legacy carriers. Okay? And there's one entrant, which was created in 1999 and had a branch that was doing wireless telecommunication and wanted to enter this market, so he was asking for a license. But of course, the 3 incumbents knew that very well, so they were lobbying the regulators heavily so that the new entrant would not get a license. And they succeeded in preventing entry until 2011. In 2011, Free Mobile, that was the name of the company, aptly named, Free, entered the market. Okay. Before 2011, with the 3 incumbents, you had the choice between paying 40 euros with the first one, or 40 euros with the second one, or 40 euros with the third one. For so remember that's 2011, so the standard contract here is like unlimited text plus, 5 megabytes of data or whatever. And for the same exact contract, Free enters at 20 euros, so literally half the price. In 6 months, they start to gain market shares, the incumbent freak out, and then they cut their own prices. So now everybody's paying 20 euros. Okay? And that's how we end up being 25% cheaper than the US. Okay? So that's one example of one. So this would be a 1 in my time series here. And then, of course, you have many countries and many industries. So if you add them up, that looks like that. Okay, so how does it look then if you accumulate these things over time? So this is data from the OECD that shows you what they consider market regulations. So these are typically regulations that restrict entry one way or another. And it's an index. They have like 4 dimensions. They just add up the indexes. Okay. In red, that's the US. And each green dot is one country in Europe. So you can see that the first vintage of this data was created in the 1997 or 8, I forgot. And as you can see, every country in Europe has more restriction to entry than the US, okay? Except for one. And as you can imagine, this is the UK. Okay? So the only country in Europe that had the traditional free market is the UK. Every other one was much more tightly regulated. And that's where I went to school. That's where I learned my trade in economics. So that was also my common wisdom. And then I think it didn't change that much. So maybe I looked again at the data in the mid-2000s, and I'm like, oh, well, nothing is changing. Okay. But it's only if you accumulate all these small changes over time that you end up at the end of the sample where it's changed a bit, actually. So now many countries in Europe have the same or even perhaps lower than in the US. Okay. So that's what happened to this index of regulation, and it matches exactly what we see in the time series for profits. Okay. So now if you look at the evolution of markups in the US versus Europe, so this is using the price that people pay for the basket of, like the CPI, except remember I kind of got rid of healthcare because that's a mess. So, so it's like the CPI inflation minus unit labor cost inflation. So if prices go up at the same speed as unit labor costs, so wages adjusted for productivity, then that number is 0. So that describes more or less what happened in Europe. Okay? That's why the margins are either flat or slightly falling, but definitely not going up. And that's what happened in the US. Price outpaced unit labor cost by about 7-8% per cumulated over the past 18, 20 years. Okay. Just to give you a sense of the numbers now, that's my kind of best estimate. If prices are 7% too high in the US, that means your median household is spending $300 extra per month. Okay. So that's significant because remember that in the survey of consumers that we have, you have about 40% of households in the US who say that it would be hard for them to cope with a $500 unexpected expense. Okay. So $300 per month, that's actually a lot of money for many people. If you aggregate for all the households in the US in 12 months, you get 600 billion per year. So that's consumer spending that corresponds to monopoly rents. Okay. And the last thing you can do is, of course, now this is just accounting. This is, of course, model-based. So now you just write a model of the economy with oligopoly rents, and you simulate what would happen if we could go back to a competitive economy. Okay. So this would happen in particular, in partial equilibrium, but then you would have all the general equilibrium impact of competition, which mostly go through the labor markets and the investment. Okay, so you would have higher investment, a tighter labor market. So the total efficiency gains would be about $1 trillion. Okay, so that's the amount by which GDP would go up, private GDP would go up today if we could go back to the competitive economy that I discovered when I arrived here as a student. So is it big or not? Well, it's 5% of private GDP. So I think it's a big number. Labor income versus profits. In this simulation, of course, market become more competitive, so the profit margins go down. At the same time, because GDP goes up, there is more demand, so firms sell more. So more quantity, less margin. For profits, could be a bit ambiguous. It turns out the margin effect dominates, so actually capital income goes down by 250 billion, and therefore labor income goes up by 1.25. Okay, so total GDP by 1 trillion. Which means that this also implements a redistribution of income from capital income towards labor income to the tune of 250 billion per year. That's actually quite significant because if you look at the data, of course, capital income is very concentrated. So that means that mostly this is coming out of the pocket of the top 5% and flowing to the pocket of the middle class. Not the very poor. The very poor, their labor income is kind of a bit not as strong, so I don't think. But people in, say, the 30th percentile to the 60th percentile, these are the guys who benefit the most here. So that's my benchmark estimate for what would happen if we had a competitive economy. And I think that's why it matters. Now, I said that I would commit to 20 minutes. So I'm going to stop here. I'm sure you have plenty of questions. And I'm happy to show you more data if you ask. But I think it's better if we let you have the floor. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas. You want to sit? You want to stand? I'll ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up. So this was incredibly compelling and important. You have a very heavy focus on consumer and markups and all of that, but there have been a lot of more discussions of issues related to inequality and other issues about distribution as well, including what you call good concentrations and exactly whether we have other laws that, in addition to antitrust or to these consumer-based measures that are part of competition. For example, Lina Khan, who you quote, says that focusing on consumer welfare disregards a host of other ways that excessive concentration can harm us, enabling firms to squeeze suppliers, producers, employees, becoming too big to fail, undermining media diversity, all kinds of other harms that may be harder for economists to measure. How do you view that? Again, there are differences. US is probably, again, worse on those dimensions. But any comment you have on that?
So there is this big debate. So Lina Khan, she's part of this new Brandeisian. That means there are people who are following the tradition of Louis Brandeis, and they have a much more encompassing view of antitrust. And typically, we oppose them to like the Chicago school of Bork et al. In the 1970s and 80s, who argued that you didn't need to worry too much about market dominance. And that's a caricature, but just for people who are not into that field. So I think on that, I'm more like, I don't know, I guess I'm halfway in between. I don't think we should change the consumer welfare standard because we haven't changed it in Europe. It works just fine. Just you have to apply it in the way we would do it in economics. So my welfare is not equal to the short-term price change between today and tomorrow. It's a discounted value of my lifetime. Therefore, if you can make the case that a particular action today, say a merger, would have zero impact on the market over the next 6 months, but potentially could preempt entry in the future or prevent the development of a new variety of good that I would like, then it could harm consumer welfare by decreasing innovation in the future. And to me, that fits right into the consumer welfare standard. So I think if you apply it flexibly, you don't need to change that standard. The one exception is people who worry about corporate power just in terms of the political economy of it. And I hear that argument, but then I think I'm still like very much an economist, and I don't like to mix things up too much. So I would be very worried about using antitrust to solve political economy issue. So I think it would be better to reform campaign finance rather than asking antitrust to solve, politics. So that's kind of my hunch. But so that's kind of the big picture. Now, specifically about that debate, though, there's one thing I want to point out, which is this. That's something that I found quite striking when we were researching. So I think that's one way maybe of understanding this Chicago School debate. Okay, so again, I'm going to make a caricature, so I hope you forgive me, but like the gist of the argument was you don't need to worry about market dominance because monopoly rents are transient. And the reason they are transient is if you think about an industry that makes too much money, it's going to attract entry, and within a few years, you're going to have competition driving out the rents. Okay, and that was the core argument in Chicago for why you shouldn't be, worried about monopoly rents, and therefore the government should not intervene too much in this. In that case, more merger reviews, but more generally. And the thing that I think is interesting is it was kind of true when they made that argument. Okay, so this is showing you the correlation between entry rates and Tobins Q in the cross-section of industries. So literally is measuring the extent to which there is more entry in industries that today look like they have high capitalized profits. Okay? You can do it with cash flows, but I think this is conceptually better here. Okay, so literally is asking, is there more entry in industry that look like they are making lots of profits today? And of course, we think the answer should be yes, right? That's exactly where we think capitalism works. And it was true when Bork et al. Were making the argument. In fact, it was true until the late 90s. So to give you a sense, this is like saying if so that's a correlation between log growth rate of employment of number of firms and Tobins Q. So it's like around 0.5 or 1, depending on which years. That's something like if excess profits or excess Q is 10% for in a particular year, then you can expect 5% more firms to enter over the next 2 or 3 years. Okay? So it's not like super fast, but if you typically that means that the half-life of this profit is something like 5 or 7 years. Okay? So if you have excess profits today, it won't go away next year, but you can expect half of it to be gone after 4 or 5 years. Okay? That's kind of the speed at which the system was adjusting. The problem is that today, this is zero. That is, if you look at the US today, there is no connection whatsoever between the number of firms entering an industry and how much money the incumbents are making in that industry. So to me, so then the long story short is, in that whole debate, to me, I'm like, it could go either way, but this is worrisome. You cannot have a system that works like that in the long run. Okay? So the crucial thing should be, do we have free entry? Okay? And if you take that perspective, I think you kind of reconcile a bit Chicago versus the rest. Because the Chicago School was arguing because of free entry, that's the reason we don't have to worry about monopoly rents. Well, if we don't have free entry, like I argue maybe we don't have anymore, then you do have to worry about it.
One of the things I was very gratified reading your book is that we share the experience of looking at the problem as an economist and when digging further, seeing that political economy is the problem. And of course, economists have been pretty blind to political economy when we analyze. So the economist Abba Lerner said, an economic transaction is a solved political problem. Economics has gained the title of the queen of social sciences by taking solved political problems as its domain. So we kind of have to go there because that determines the outcomes ultimately. And so on this, I want to point to what we are all doing and what we teach our students, what we do research on, how we spend our times. And also to ask, if we look in the mirror, what has been the role of economists, even in this antitrust debate. There have been a lot of good consulting jobs that have brought people millions of dollars helping the mergers. And we also teach that, we should take all projects that have positive net present value, which could include hiring that lobbyist to make sure you maintain your fences and market power. So the question, and Luigi Zingales, who's another finance academic who speaks to political economy, spoke as well and wrote on bias that economists have and the sort of potential capture that they say other people can have except themselves, bias against, in favor of finance and business in general, et cetera. So my question finally is, to what extent do you think we academics, we in what we research, what we teach, are part of the problem? And certainly in writing an accessible book, you have taken the pain of communicating more broadly than in our seminar rooms about these issues. How do you think we might alter what we do or how we teach or what activities we choose or the research topics to try to help this political economy problem to actually make things better? So it's like, what now should we be doing? Everybody else, ourselves?
Yeah, so, I mean, I think that specifically for economists, I think that there are maybe two biases. One is you could make the case, in fact, I believe it's kind of true, that there was a bit of a market failure in academia in the 2000s running up to the crisis, which was more for the finance professors who didn't see the crisis coming and didn't have like the tools to warn policymakers that there was too much leverage in the system and eventually something bad would happen. So there was like a market failure there, I think. I think to some extent the same market failure happened in IO, in recent years, where it was just slow to react, and therefore when the question were asked, what should we do now, it turns out that we were not ready. So I think that now the question is why. I think in both cases you can make the case, of course, that there is you have an incentive to cozy up to the industry. I think that's part of it. But specific economists, sometimes I think it's just like we like to measure stuff. So for us, things don't exist if we don't measure them. So at the end of the day, I think it's more like, can we measure it? And then, because in my experience with economists, if you can point to data and measurement, then people listen. Like the biases go away. The biases only survive if there is no data, in other words. So I think I would still argue that the first order of business is to get the data. And sometimes it's hard. Like this is like, we try to compare lobbying expenditures, you realize that the data is terrible. The best you can do is rely on this murky data. But I'm encouraged by the fact that there's lots of really smart people working on these topics now and getting much better data. And the more they dig, the more people get interested. And I think that's by far the best way to go forward. The best we can measure it, it looks like lobbying fits the pattern also to a large extent. So lobbying in Europe today looks like lobbying in the US 20 years ago. But in the meantime, lobbying in the US has skyrocketed. It didn't stop there, and by the way. This is part of the measurement issue, which is because the enforcement of fines for people who don't report correctly has stopped in 2010, then it looks like it's flat. But of course, it kept going up. We just don't know how much. So I think it fits the pattern, yeah. But I would still put data first. Like we would just want to be able to measure these things.
I know you mentioned campaign finance reform as what you believe to be one of the main policy prescriptions to tackle this issue, and I definitely agree with that. My two related questions would be, one, what form would that take? And two, how do you think that those actual policy prescriptions could be implemented in a time where a lot of politicians are basically like, they receive campaign contributions from big business, and you have a Supreme Court which has demonstrated in the past that it's okay to have money in politics, especially with the Citizens United decision? Yeah,
so there's a discussion of the Citizens United case in the book. If you're pessimistic, you can say, well, the last time we tried to have so I agree with you first. This is a topic where you need bipartisan consensus, otherwise it's not going to work. The last time we had that was the McCain-Feingold, 15 years ago. The question is, can that fly again? I don't know, but I know that if you don't try, it doesn't work. And I know that the alternative is not great, because the alternative is, if you can't fix it, then you're going to try to use other tools to go after the same issue. And that's the main argument of people in the Brandesian view of antitrust, which is they would like to then use antitrust to limit the influence of big firms on politics. And then that means it's going to make the antitrust implementation even more political, which I think is a bad idea in the first place. So I would much rather spend my energy on trying to reform campaign finance. Now, it's not easy, but I think it's still the right place to start. Because lobbying, for instance, by itself, lobbying is fine. I mean, your lobbying is protected by the Constitution, so I think you cannot directly limit these things, but you can limit the part of it that enters directly into campaign finance. I think that would be my start. That would also bring it back closer to what many other countries are doing. Like if you look at every other country, typically there has some limits on campaign finance, not on lobbying. So.
You gave that comparison between the U.S. and Europe, and I just wonder how sanguine you are about the persistence of the changes that you've seen in Europe. In the sense
great.
If I think about, for example, the airline industry was very regulated in the U.S., went through a period of intense competition where profits were basically zero, and then there's been a shakeout and we see more monopoly concentration. Is Europe just going to follow the same pattern? That is, it's just happening a bit later, where we're going to see a lot of competition, but then ultimately they're all competing to be the top three who are going to capture the prize. And
absolutely.
So how sustainable is that?
Yeah, so I had that discussion with Luigi Zingales that you mentioned, because there are two views. One is corruption takes time. So Europe is just 20 years behind the US, but heading in the same direction. And the other view is institutions have their own logic. The reason it's really cool because it also goes at the heart of all what we think about the theory of institutions. How persistent are they? So let me give you one data on that one. Which is, at the end of the day, I come down to the side which is slightly optimistic, precisely because I think that many of the institutions in Europe are pretty locked up. Like, it's very hard to change. But let me just frame that a bit more precisely so people understand. It's very, very strange what happened in Europe, okay? Because you remember I showed you that pre-1995, there's only one country in Europe that has a traditional free market, that's the UK. Everybody else has a tradition of protect your domestic champions, have no independent regulator, because independent regulators cannot be controlled by politicians, so that's not good. Politicians would like to control industry, mergers, all kinds of decisions. So this is a tradition in every country in continental Europe, okay? Very long historical tradition. Now you put 18 of these people around the table to design the single market rules in the mid-90s, and you would expect, now naively, don't think too hard, then you think, what are they going to do? Well, they're probably going to replicate at the EU level what they were doing at the country level, okay? That's like the natural guess. And then you look at what they did, exactly the opposite. They went 180 degrees the other way. They ended up with a regulator which is much more pro-consumer, pro-competition, and much more independent than in the US. So how come the same people who at home don't like free market, when you put them together, suddenly they love free market, okay? So that's why I started. And so that's a paradox, but it won't be a paradox for you because, of course, when you understand game theory, it's not a paradox anymore. The Nash equilibrium has changed. See, at home, what you want is to control your industries. At the EU level, what you're mostly worried is the other countries controlling the regulator against you. So the Germans were worried that the French would influence the regulator. The French were worried that the Germans would do the same. And every single small country in Europe was worried that if they are in a union with France and Germany, then if these two get together and agree, they can impose their decision on everybody else. So the Netherlands would not have joined a union like that, okay? So then what's the Nash equilibrium? We commit not to intervene. We design the regulator so nobody can influence the regulator. So that's exactly what we did. You see it in the data. So this is the extent to which the regulator is just pro-free market and independent. So the green is the measurement for the EU institutions, and the red is the measurement for the exact same institutions at the national level. You see this discrete increase, like the EU institutions are discretely more pro-consumer choice and independent than their national counterparts. In fact, to the point that they're even higher than the US, which is in blue. Okay? And even that is understating because this is measured in 06. By 06, the national regulators are catching up already. So the initial gap, if you could measure that thing 10 years earlier, would have been even bigger. Now, that's why I'm a bit optimistic, is because I think this outcome was not a fluke of history, even though if you read the text, what people wrote at the time, they understood part of it, but not the full extent. But I think it's the Nash equilibrium. I don't think it's changing. So that's why I'm optimistic. Okay? But, maybe I'm wrong. I understand.
Hi.
My name is Namdi Rekblum. I'm a student at the business school. Thank you for your talk. I'm definitely very sympathetic to some of the arguments you put forth here, but I think the thing that's still a bit unclear for me is sort of the relative mix between the good concentration versus the bad concentration. And I don't know if you're seeing the recent research by David Otter and a couple other folks around superstar firms, and I think they were talking about labor share specifically as their concentration measure, but that effectively showed that productivity amongst superstar firms could explain most of the increase in concentration over time. And so given that would be the good concentration under your sort of framework, how do you think about that? How do you respond to that evidence?
Great question. So the first thing is that it was actually true in the 90s, but it's not true anymore today. So much of their correlation between productivity and consumption comes from the pre-2000 period. And on that, I agree with them. The post-2000 period, it's not true. The thing is, the data is very complicated. So let me give you one example of what people do wrong. Many people look at, say, the top firms in the US, but today they are all global firms. So their sales compared to US GDP has gone up because of the fact that they also sell abroad. If you scale it back to their domestic sales, they don't look that great anymore. Or if you scale it by global GDP, they also don't look that strange anymore. So the idea that the superstar firms are pulling ahead is actually not that true. In other words, it was very more true in the 80s and 90s, but today it's not that true. And I can show you the data on that. So this is the exact, this is precisely measuring the contribution of the top firms to total growth in the US economy. Okay? So you take the top 100 firms in the US, either by market value or by total revenues, it's kind of the same. So you have only 100 firms, okay? And then you count how much these firms pull the entire economy forward. In other words, what is the labor productivity growth that exclusively is driven by these top 100 firms? There are millions of businesses in the US. But of course, the distribution is so skewed that the big firms are very, very big. So even though you have only 100 of them, they contribute whopping like 75 basis points of aggregate labor productivity growth, just 100. Okay. How do they do that? Well, you have typically two channels. They have internal growth in green. That's, the same firm gets better and better. And then you have external growth in red, which is they attract inputs, and because they are better at using the inputs, then aggregate productivity goes up. So if you add the two channels, then you get the blue line, which is the total contribution. You see it's very big in the 90s, okay? But if you look at the recent years, the star firms don't pull the economy that much anymore. Now, that to me is a very interesting fact. And the reason it's happening is actually also interesting. So, of course, the star firms change decade by decade. Okay? Even like, take the top 5, because there you can give names, okay? If you look at the top 5 firms decade by decade in the US, in the post-war period, 1955, you had the big boom of car making. GM is at the top. AT&T then follows. Then you have IBM in the 70s. Then you have Procter & Gamble. Then you have Walmart in the 90s. And then you have... So the list changes, okay? But the idea that the top 5 of today... Of course, today the top 5 are all the tech firms, okay? It's Google, Amazon, Facebook, Microsoft, and Apple. But compared to other firms today, they are great. But the same way IBM was great compared to all the other firms. And in fact, the ratio is the same. So if you look at the total market value of equity of the top 5 firms in the US compared to the total market value of all equity in the US, it's been 10% for 40 years. It was already 10% in 1980, it was 10% in 1990, and it's 10% today. So the market is bigger, the numbers, the dollar values are bigger. But in the terms of how much do they dominate the market, actually, they dominate the market the same way the stars of the past did. The difference is that many of them are actually smaller. So they don't pull the economy as much, in part because their internal growth is quite good, although again, it's not, if you look at the internal growth of AT&T in the days, or even, it was amazing, their productivity growth. So by that measure, Facebook is fine, but it's nothing spectacular. But these firms in the past tended to be much larger in their network of suppliers. And so when they became more productive, it had a ripple effect on the economy. Formally, it's as if you have like lots of suppliers and you become 1% more productive, it's formally equivalent to pretty much all your suppliers also becoming 1% more productive. And that meant that there was some kind of big multiplication, big multiplier effect. That's one of the reasons these only 100 firms managed to pull the economy so much. Today, the problem of Google and Facebook is, they are very insular in that sense. So when they get better, their profits go up, but you don't see a ripple effect in the whole economy. The one exception to that, of course, is Amazon. So Amazon is entirely different, and when you look at Amazon, you do see that impact. So I don't disagree that there are star firms. It's just the idea that they are more star-like than in the past. That one I don't think is true.
My question comes from my perspective as a student. My thought is that there's a lot of these concentrated industries, say medicine, that you talk about, that in some sense, there have been an increase in rents due to increase in lower competition. But in some sense, as students, we've dissipated all those rents through our tuition, through our time, through opportunity costs, right? This is the story that doctors need high wages because they paid already so much money in the medical school to get there. MBA students have paid hundreds of thousands of dollars of tuition to get to the MBA position where they can take all the positive NPV projects. I feel like similarly as a PhD student, I've dissipated many of the rents to get here to maybe this like life of a professor that also is supported by rents and that I eat lunch in rents.
Well,
and I kind of wonder,
get the free lunch, the first thing to learn.
I can definitely get behind from like a welfare perspective, it's better to lower the barriers or whatever, but from a persuasive perspective, how would you persuade someone that perhaps has already dissipated all their dynamic rents, that I made a zero NPV transaction to go to my PhD program.
Yeah, I agree.
That you're going to take away the rents, and then how do I persuade that that's okay?
So there are two answers to that. The one is that some of these rents are in industries that are not like super fancy. Again, airlines and telecom is not super fancy. And the way we got the rents down in Europe in these industries was also not super fancy. Just give a license, force them to share their network. In the case of airlines, just bringing EasyJet and Ryanair. You could do it in the US. Just open slot for EasyJet at Chicago and New York, and you believe me, the price are going to go down. You're never going to do that because the airlines, of course, are going to refuse to, But that would be an easy solution, and I would get around that because nobody is going to then say, oh, but these airlines, they somehow signed a zero NPV contract. No, they didn't. So I think for many industries, the solutions are not that complicated. And then you have industries where like healthcare is the prime example. But there you also get quickly into something that, we talk about it from time to time in economics, but the idea that I think it's useful X inefficiency, but it's basically the idea that when you have low competition, you have the distortion we talk about in class, but you also typically have waste. And in the healthcare system, it's exactly like that, which is the reason it's so costly is just the rents are very inefficiently distributed, which means that, yeah, if you take away the rents, some people are going to lose. And that I don't think the political economy of that is going to get any simpler anytime soon. That I agree.
A couple of months ago, we had Gabriel Zuckman here presenting his newest book. And what I wanted to ask you is, what are two great French economists and others arguing so passionately for these changes, in the U.S.? And basically, what are the implications if things go in the direction that you think for France and for other countries? Because we focus most of the discussion on the domestic implications.
Yeah, I think there are way too many French economists in the economic debate in the US. I agree with you. I think for me the main thing about the main comparison with what Gabriel is doing is that at the end of the day, I do believe that free market should be relatively bipartisan, and that antitrust should be relatively bipartisan. So I'm trying to push. If you think about redistribution, given the size of GDP, then there is no way that's going to ever become bipartisan. It doesn't mean it's a wrong debate. It's an important one to have. We all have our opinions. I'm fine. But I'm trying to pitch something slightly different, which is, if you look at, say, airlines and telecom, it was half Carter, half Reagan. They didn't agree on it. These two guys agreed on nothing, except that free markets are good. And so I think going back to that to me sounds like a low-hanging fruit. So that's what I'm trying to pitch. Now, it would have a redistribution effect. It turns out, funnily enough, that this number here, that's why I put it back, is very close to the impact in the cross-section of the wealth tax that Warren proposed first. It's about, because the annualized value of the redistribution from the wealth tax was 240 billion. So it's very close. Now, of course, it's not exactly the same, right? Because that doesn't help the very poor. This only helps the middle and lower middle class. But yeah, I think there is some connection there. I agree. I think free market can help poor people. I buy that argument.
Can you talk about the implications of your suggestions here on Federal Reserve policy? Because at the core, this seems to be deflationary, likely deflationary, at a time when we continue to run below policy.
Yeah, that's a good question. So first of all, these numbers are real in the sense that you could, it's like real wages going down, stuff like that. But you could imagine, so the calculations don't depend on Fed policy. Also, these estimates, they are not instantaneous. And this is like after 5 years, after the economy has adjusted. But it turns out, surprisingly enough, specific on that one, is that it is not deflationary. And the first time I ran the simulation, I was like, that's kind of weird, because prices are going down. Well, in fact, not really. Because, again, it's a bit like this game here between this is an efficiency gain. So profits are going down, but not a lot. Why is that? Because demand is going up. So in fact, when you run the simulation, what happens is firms have to lower their price relative to cost, at least. But at the same time, because of the demand impact of strong competition, the fact that the people who save money have more money to spend on other goods, and you're going to increase your capex because of competition, it turns out that creates an increase in aggregate demand. In the standard New Keynesian model, it turns out the impact on inflation is zero. So in fact, it turns out it's actually not deflationary. But it could be. I don't disagree. I don't think it would be. It more has an impact on the exchange rate, actually. That's more the way you see it. But yeah.
Most of your discussion has sort of focused on microeconomics of adding additional competition to promote free markets. At the global scale, one of the big issues, of course, is climate change, where free markets are potentially the problem rather than the solution. So do you have any sort of thoughts about dealing with that issue as well as the microeconomic issues you've been focused on?
Yeah, so I looked at whether there was like something specific about like the fossil fuel or this kind of, these effects are mostly, they're across the board in many industries, so they don't tend to correlate very much with industries that have a small or big carbon footprint. So I don't think it would have a gigantic impact either way, that specific thing. Like just in the US, just like maybe $100 out of this 300 is telecom. If you add up the cable, broadband plus wireless services, the extra saving, almost like a third of that is just telecom. So that one, I don't think it would change very much the footprint. There is a bit of action in the energy sector, because it's true that energy, like if you look at household, the number of providers for natural gas and electricity has shrunk over time. But I think because I don't know if these demand are so elastic that if the price was lower, I think people would mostly save it. I don't know if they would necessarily spend a lot more on heating. Could be, but I think the net effect doesn't seem to be very big. So in terms of the global landscape, I don't think it would interact a lot with climate change. The one place where it interacts is the argument more vis-a-vis China as a technological competitor with the US. So a lot of the arguments you hear, especially close to the defense industry, is that we need these big monopolies because we want to be able to fight with the Chinese monopolies. So that's where I think, at least in my view, that's where the big global discussion is a bit messed up. I think these arguments are mostly wrong, maybe except for like some specific application of AI in defense. For all the rest, it's mostly like the usual self-serving story that the lobbyists use. So I don't buy it, but I know that in practice, that's the argument they are making. Not so much the climate change, but definitely the China threat in Europe as well.
Well, thank you very much for coming.